My daughter looked at me across the white tablecloth of the finest restaurant I had ever set foot in, smiled the way people smile when they want to appear kind without actually being kind, and said, "Mom, honestly, you should have just stayed home. You don't really fit in with this crowd." The entire table went quiet for exactly 1 second. Then her husband, my son-in-law Brendan Walsh, cleared his throat and reached for his wine glass. And everyone pretended the words hadn't just landed in the center of the room like something dropped from a great height. I sat there holding my small beaded purse, the one my husband Thomas bought me at a craft fair in Savannah the summer before he got sick. And I did not say a single word. I simply reached down slowly, smoothed the front of my dress, and looked at my daughter the way only a mother can look at someone she has loved longer than that person has been alive. Her name is Stephanie. Stephanie Walsh now, though she was born Stephanie Aldridge, in a hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina. During a thunderstorm so bad, the power flickered twice. I held her before the nurses even finished counting her fingers. That is the first thing I want you to understand about me, about this story. Before anything else, I was her mother. I live in a small house in Greensboro. The shutters on the front windows need repainting, and the floorboard near the kitchen door has creaked in the same spot for 11 years, and I have never fixed it because somehow the sound became part of the house's voice. Thomas and I bought it the year Stephanie turned 4. We planted a dogwood tree in the front yard together, all 3 of us, Thomas digging, while Stephanie held the tiny sapling, and I read the instructions off the paper tag, out loud like they were scripture. That tree is enormous now, taller than the roofline. I look at it every morning from the kitchen window while the coffee brews. After Thomas died 7 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 61 days from diagnosis to the end, the house became something different. Not a bad different, just quieter, more careful about itself. The way people become after grief teaches them that nothing lasts forever, and maybe that's the point. Stephanie called every Sunday for the first year. Then it became every other Sunday. Then once a month, sometimes less. I understood. She had a life in Atlanta now. A good life, a beautiful apartment, a husband who wore expensive watches and had an opinion about wine regions. She worked in marketing for a luxury hospitality brand, the kind of company that had its own font and referred to hotels as properties and guests as curated experiences. I was proud of her. That part is important too. I was always proud of her. 3 weeks before the dinner, she called on a Tuesday, which was unusual enough that I answered on the first ring. "Mom." Her voice carried the particular brightness she used when she wanted something. "How would you feel about coming to Atlanta?" "How would you feel?" I sat down on the edge of the couch. "I'd feel wonderful about it." A pause, just a short one, the kind filled with careful calculation. "Brendan's firm is hosting a charity dinner. It's a big deal, some very important people, clients, donors. We'd love to have you there. We'd love to have you." I pressed my hand flat against my collarbone the way I always do when my chest fills with something too large to name. "I'd be honored," I said. Another pause. "Dress nicely, okay? It's a formal event." I laughed softly. "I do know what formal means, sweetheart." She laughed too, but the sound had something tight underneath it that I chose not to hear. Because lonely people become experts at choosing not to hear things. After we hung up, I sat still for a while. Just sat there in Thomas's old chair with the armrests worn soft from years of his elbows, and I let myself feel happy. Genuinely, cleanly happy. My daughter wanted me at something important. That was enough. That was more than enough. I spent the next week preparing. I took my good dress, a deep burgundy crepe with a modest neckline, the one I wore to my niece's wedding 3 years ago, to the woman at the dry cleaner on Elm Street who had pressed Thomas's shirts for 20 years. I found my small pearl drop earrings in the velvet box in my top dresser drawer, the ones Thomas gave me for our 35th anniversary. I polished my black heels at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, buffing them until they reflected the overhead light. My granddaughter called me that Friday night. Chloe, Stephanie's daughter from her first marriage, 14 years old, and the most perceptive person I have ever known in any generation. She has her grandfather's eyes and her great-grandmother's habit of saying the true thing before anyone is ready to hear it. Grandma Dot. She always called me that even though my name is not Dorothy. It started when she was 2 and it stuck, and now I answer to it before I answer to anything else. "There's my girl," I said. "Are you going to Mom's dinner thing?" "I am next Saturday." Silence on her end. Not empty silence, thinking silence. "Chloe, she stopped. "Just don't let them make you feel bad, okay?" The words landed strangely. Why would anyone make me feel bad? But before she could answer, I heard Stephanie's voice somewhere in the background, sharp and brief. And then Chloe said she had to go, and the line went quiet. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment. After that, phone still in my hand, a small cold feeling moved through me, and I pushed it away, the way you push away a thought you know will cost you sleep if you let it settle. Mothers survive on hope longer than they survive on logic. That is not wisdom. That is just what we do. The morning of the dinner, I woke before 5. Pinned back on one side, soft on the other. I put on the burgundy dress and the pearl earrings and stood in front of the full-length mirror on the back of the bedroom door. I looked like myself, not glamorous, not young, but like myself, put together, and careful and clean. And I had long since made peace with the fact that sometimes being yourself is the most dignity you can carry into a room. Before I left, I stopped in front of the small framed photo on the hallway table. Thomas and me, Stephanie between us, at her college graduation. She is laughing at something just off camera, and Thomas has his arm around my shoulders. And I am looking at her, and not at the camera, because I couldn't take my eyes off her that day. All that pride, all that hope. "Okay," I said quietly to the photo. Then I picked up my purse and drove to Atlanta. The restaurant was in Midtown, the kind of place where the lighting is calculated to make everyone look important. And the menu has no prices. Because the kind of people who need to check prices are not supposed to be there. I knew the name before I arrived because I had looked it up online the night before and sat with the website for 10 minutes and studying the interior photographs and the reviews that used words like transcendent and architecturally significant. The valet took my 11-year-old Camry without any visible reaction, which I appreciated. Inside, the hostess greeted me with a professional smile. When I gave Stephanie's name, something shifted almost imperceptibly in her posture. A fractional hesitation before she said, "Of course! Right this way!" Stephanie was already at the table when I arrived. She stood when she saw me, and for one moment, just one, I saw relief cross her face before something more controlled replaced it. She kissed my cheek quickly. "Mom, you made it." "Of course I made it." Brendan Walsh shook my hand with the particular firmness men use when they are performing confidence rather than feeling it. He was handsome in a groomed, expensive way, the kind of handsome that requires a lot of maintenance. "Ruth," he said, "good to see you." "My name is Ruth Aldridge. I want to be clear about that, because for much of that evening, it felt like it didn't matter. The table was long and full of people who worked very hard to appear effortless. Women whose jewelry told quiet but definitive stories about net worth. Men who referred to things by their initials as if abbreviation itself were a form of intimacy. I was seated at the end nearest the wall, which I understood immediately was not the position of honor. A woman across from me, introduced as one of Brendan's senior colleagues, smiled pleasantly. "And what do you do, Ruth?" Before I could answer, Stephanie said, "Mom's retired. She lives up in Greensboro." "How lovely," the woman said, in the tone people use when they mean the opposite of lovely. A man to Brendan's right, Collier Hayes, someone had said, a name that carried its own kind of authority. Leaned toward Brendan and made a low comment I wasn't meant to hear but did. Something about people who don't quite fit the room. Brendan's jaw tightened and he said nothing, which is its own kind of answer. I reached for my water glass. The dinner progressed the way these things do. In waves of conversation I was occasionally invited into, and more often excluded from, not cruelly, just efficiently. The way people organize spaces around what they consider necessary and unnecessary. I watched Stephanie across the table. She was brilliant tonight, animated, charming, magnetic in a way that made my chest ache with pride even as something else ached too. She was extraordinary. She had always been extraordinary. I just wasn't sure she remembered where extraordinary had first been recognized. Then the wine arrived and someone's elbow caught a glass near the center of the table, and a small wave of red moved across the white tablecloth toward me, with the particular inevitability of accidents in formal settings. A few drops caught the front of my dress. Not many. Barely visible. But visible. I blotted it quickly with my napkin and said it was nothing. Stephanie looked at the stain, then at Brendan, then back at me. Something crossed her face that I had been trying not to name all evening. She leaned slightly forward. "Mom," she said quietly. But not quietly enough. "This is exactly why I said. Started again. You really should have let us know your size. We could have arranged something. As if I were a problem requiring a solution rather than a person who had arrived dressed and clean and willing. The woman across from me looked down at her plate. Collier Hayes cleared his throat. Brendan said nothing. Stephanie, seeming to gain something from not being contradicted, continued even more quietly but still loud enough. "Mom, honestly, you should have just stayed home. You don't really fit in with this crowd." There it was. I have replayed those words many times since that night. The specific casualness of them. Not shouted, not dramatic. Just stated like weather. Like fact. Like something she had thought for a long time and simply ran out of a reason to keep holding back. The entire table went silent. Then Collier Hayes reached for his wine, and someone else picked up a fork, and the world resumed around me while I sat very still, holding my small beaded purse in my lap, and thought about my daughter at 4 years old, clutching a sapling with both hands while her father dug a hole in the front yard. I did not cry. I did not defend myself. I looked at Stephanie for a long, quiet moment, long enough that she finally looked away first. And then slowly I reached into my purse and took out my phone. I scrolled to a name I had not called in almost 2 years. Walter Gaines. I pressed the button and lifted the phone to my ear. He answered on the second ring. "Ruth." His voice was exactly the same as I remembered. Steady, like a foundation wall. "Walter," I said. "It's time to move forward." A pause. "Are you certain?" I looked across the table at my daughter, who was now engaging the woman beside her in quiet, animated conversation, seemingly unaware or unwilling to be aware of what she had just done. "Yes," I said. "I'm certain. I'll make some calls tonight," Walter said. "We'll meet Monday." I thanked him and put the phone away. I excused myself briefly, walked to the restroom, stood at the marble sink, and looked at my own face in the mirror for a while. The pearl earrings caught the light. I thought about Thomas. I thought about who I had been before I became someone's mother and someone's wife, and about how neither of those things ever stopped being true, but they were not the only things that were true. When I returned to the table, a young server, couldn't have been more than 22, stepped close and said quietly, "I'm so sorry about earlier, ma'am. That wasn't right." Just that. He didn't wait for a response. Small kindnesses from strangers stay with you in ways that large kindnesses from family sometimes fail to. I sat back down. I finished my dinner. I was polite to everyone around me in the way I had always been polite, because that was not something I was willing to surrender. It was near the end of the evening, while coffee was being served, that Collier Hayes leaned over and asked me something I hadn't expected. "You said you're retired, Ruth. What from?" "Real estate development," I said. He paused with his cup halfway to his mouth. "Commercial or residential?" "Both, for most of my career. I focused primarily on mixed-use development in the Southeast for the last 15 years. He set the cup down. "Which firm?" "I ran my own, Aldridge Property Group. I sold my interest in it 8 years ago when my husband became ill." The silence from Collier Hayes was a different quality of silence than the one that had followed Stephanie's words earlier. This one had weight in a different direction. "I know that name," he said slowly. "Most people in commercial real estate in the Carolinas do," I said pleasantly. Stephanie had gone very still at the other end of the table. Brendan was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before. Walter Gaines, as it turned out, was not just my late husband's attorney. He was also the trustee of a private investment portfolio. Thomas and I had built over 40 years, quietly and without fanfare, in the way people build things when they are not building for appearance. Commercial properties, development partnerships, long-term holdings. The kind of wealth that does not announce itself at dinner tables, or wear itself on wrists, or park itself in front of restaurants expecting to be noticed. I had been careful, over the years, to keep that life separate from my relationship with Stephanie, because Thomas and I had both believed the same thing. That children should learn what they are capable of before they learn what they stand to inherit. That love should precede expectation. That people should become themselves first. We may have been wrong about the timing. That is the part I have turned over in my mind most often since that night. The next morning, Stephanie knocked on the door of my hotel room at 7:30. I had been awake since 5. I opened the door and she stood in the hallway in jeans and no makeup, which was the most honest I had seen her look in years. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. She sat on the edge of the small upholstered chair by the window. I sat on the bed. Between us was the distance that had been accumulating for years without either of us naming it. "Collier Hayes called Brendan last night," she said. I waited. "He said." She stopped, pressed her fingers together in her lap. "He said he knew your company. Aldridge Property Group. He said it was one of the most respected mid-sized development firms in the Southeast." She looked up at me. "He asked Brendan how he hadn't known that about his own mother-in-law." I looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline. Gray morning light, a few early clouds. "Mom!" Her voice had changed. Something in it had gone soft and unguarded in a way I hadn't heard in a long time. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Tell you what, Stephanie?" She shook her head slightly. "Any of it. The company, the investments, any of it." I looked at her for a moment. Would it have mattered? The question sat between us. She didn't answer right away, and the not answering was its own kind of answer, and we both knew it. "Last night," she started. "Was painful," I said. Not accusatory. Just true. She closed her eyes briefly. "I know. You've been ashamed of me for a while," I said. "I think last night was just the first time you said it out loud." She opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. "I haven't been. Stephanie." My voice was gentle, but it was not uncertain. "When I visited at Christmas 2 years ago, you introduced me to your neighbors as my mom from Greensboro, and then you changed the subject before they could ask me anything. When I came to Brendan's company picnic the year before that, you steered me away from his senior partners and kept me near the food tables. Last spring when I called during your work dinner, you called me back 3 days later." She looked at her hands. "I'm not saying this to wound you," I said. "I'm saying it because I think you've been telling yourself a story about who I am that doesn't quite match who I actually am. And last night," I paused. "Last night, that story escaped in front of strangers, and some part of you probably knew it would." She was crying now. Not dramatic tears. Just quiet ones, the kind that come when something finally breaks through. "I don't know when it started," she admitted. "I do," I said. "When you and Brendan got serious, you started measuring things differently. You started measuring me against his world and finding me." I stopped, chose the next word carefully. "Inconvenient." She didn't deny it. That mattered. "Your father would have said," I began, and then my own voice caught, which I had not expected. I pressed my hand flat against my sternum and waited a moment. "Thomas would have said that people who confuse presentation with value are very expensive to love." Stephanie laughed once, a short broken sound. "It does," I agreed. We sat quietly for a while. Outside, Atlanta was starting its morning. Delivery trucks, distant traffic, someone running on the sidewalk below with a bright orange jacket. "Walter called me this morning," I said finally. She looked up carefully. "I've asked him to restructure some things. Charitable trust designations, investment accounts, some property decisions that have been pending for a few years." I looked at her steadily. "Not to punish you. Because it's time. And because what happened last night reminded me that I've been putting off things I shouldn't put off." "What does that mean?" "It means there's a community land trust in Greensboro that Thomas and I promised our support to before he died, and I've been delaying finalizing the commitment. It means there's a scholarship fund at NC State in Thomas's name that I've been meaning to endow for 2 years. It means," I paused, "it means I've been living very small inside my own life because I was waiting for something. I'm not entirely sure what. Permission, maybe. Or proof that I was still wanted somewhere." The last sentence cost me more than I showed. Stephanie pressed her fingers over her mouth for a moment. When she lowered her hand, her voice was unsteady. "You are wanted." "I know," I said gently. "But I'd like to feel it, not just be told it." She nodded slowly. "Then, what can I do?" I looked at my daughter, 41 years old, brilliant, capable, lost in some way she was only beginning to understand. She looked younger than she had in years, sitting there in jeans without the armor of the life she'd constructed. She looked briefly like the girl who held a sapling with 2 hands and trusted that something would grow. "Start over," I said simply. "With me. Not the version of me you decided I was, the actual me." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't know about the company. I didn't know about the investments. I didn't know any of it. I know you didn't. But you're saying that's not actually the point." "That's exactly right," I said. "It's not the point at all." She understood. I could see it happen, slowly, the way real understanding happens. Not like a light turning on, but like something surfacing from water, gradual and certain. "The woman I sent away from the table last night," she said quietly. "She deserved to be there. She deserved to be anywhere she chose to be," I said. "As did the version of me who didn't own a company. As would the version of me who never had. That's what I need you to understand, Stephanie. The answer to who I am does not change based on the balance of an account." We had breakfast together that morning, just the 2 of us, at a small place 3 blocks from the hotel, the kind of place with paper menus and coffee refills without asking. We talked for 2 hours, not about business, not about money, about Thomas, about Chloe and how extraordinary she was already becoming, about the dogwood tree in the front yard, about the first time Stephanie rode a bike, and how I ran alongside her the whole length of Elm Street with my hand barely touching the back of the seat, and how the moment she didn't need me anymore was the happiest, and the saddest I'd ever been simultaneously, and how that paradox is the whole of motherhood if you're paying attention. She cried again. So did I. Brendan met us outside afterward. He stood there looking uncertain in a way I had never seen him look. He said, "Ruth, I owe you an apology. Short, direct." I respected it more than a longer speech would have allowed. "Thank you, Brendan," I said. "I'd like to start fresh if that's agreeable to you." He nodded. Something in his posture released. Chloe called me that afternoon, as if she'd known. "Grandma Dot. Hello, my girl. Are you okay?" I looked out the car window at the highway unspooling back toward Greensboro, the long, flat stretches of pine and red clay that I have loved my whole life without ever quite saying so out loud. "I am," I said. "Actually, I think I might be better than okay." "Good." A pause. Then, "Did you tell Mom off?" I laughed. "Not exactly." "Did you tell her the truth?" "Yes." "That's the same thing," Chloe said, with the serene certainty of someone who has not yet learned to complicate the obvious. The weeks that followed were not simple. Repair never is. Stephanie called more often, and some of the calls were easy and some were harder, conversations where we circled the wound carefully before either of us could touch it directly. Brendan started coming to those calls sometimes, which surprised me, and which I eventually decided to take as its own kind of apology in practice. I finalized the scholarship fund at NC State in Thomas's name. I completed the land trust commitment. I called Walter Gaines and told him to begin the process of reorganizing the portfolio the way we'd discussed. And when he asked again if I was sure, I said yes with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. I also repainted the shutters on my house. By myself on a clear October Saturday, with a radio on the porch and coffee going cold on the railing. Thomas would have said I should have hired someone. I did it myself, because I wanted to feel the weight of the brush, the smell of the paint, the particular satisfaction of a thing made better by my own hands. Chloe came to visit the following month. She stood in the front yard and looked at the dogwood tree, which was still holding a few late leaves amber and rust against the gray November sky. "Grandpa planted that?" "We all did," I said. "Your mother held the sapling." She looked at it for a moment. "She should remember that more." "I think she's starting to," I said. Chloe turned to me. "Grandma Dot? Yes? I'm glad you went to that dinner." I considered that. The burgundy dress still hung in my closet with the faint ghost of a stain at the hem that the dry cleaner had nearly but not entirely removed. The pearl earrings were back in their velvet box. My beaded purse sat on the hall table where I always left it. "You know," I said. "So am I." She slipped her hand into mine the way she had since she was small, unself-consciously, without calculation, the way only children and very old friends can do. We stood there together under the tree. Thomas and I planted. In the yard of the house where Stephanie learned to walk. In the city where I had built a life out of love and loss and very quiet determination. And I thought about what it means to be known. Really known. Not for what you own, or what you've built, or what you appear to be standing next to someone else. But for the full, unedited, uncurated truth of yourself. That is the only table any of us deserve to sit at. And I have never once been too poor for it.